Good evening, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's discussion of A Revolution in Type. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. We also hope that you'll join us this weekend for the museum's Mishpucha Festival, which is a celebration of heritage, genealogy, and immigration. So you can learn more on the museum's website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So today we are so honored to be joined by Ayelet Brinn and Tony Michaels. Ayelet is an assistant professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford, where she holds the Philip D. Feldman Professorship in Modern Jewish History. After receiving her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, she held a joint postdoctoral fellowship in Jewish Studies at Columbia University and Fordham University, and was the Ivan and Nina Ross Family Fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and was a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. Her first book, which we will be discussing this evening, A Revolution in Type, Gender and the Making of the American Yiddish Press, was released in November 2023 with New York University Press. Tony is the George L. Massey Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York, Jewish Radicals, A Documentary History, and co-editor, with Mitchell Hart of the Cambridge History of Judaism, Volume 8, The Modern World, 1815 to 2000. He is finishing a book with the working title Jews and Revolution from the United States to Russia and Back. You can purchase A Revolution in Type at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And now I'm going to hand things over to Ayelet and Tony.
Hey, thank you so much, Sydney. Ayelet, this is, first of all, congratulations. It is wonderful to see this beautiful book in print. We started talking about this book at an early point in its development, and I saw different parts of it as they developed, and now to see it in print, in type, it's really fantastic. So congratulations on a wonderful achievement.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for being in conversation with me today. I'm really excited about it.
Well, I look forward to many more in the future. Why don't you start by telling us what the book is about?
Sure. So it's a broad exploration of the relationship of the American Yiddish press to questions of gender over time. And I'm arguing basically that you can't understand the history of the Yiddish press without understanding how questions of gender and women were central to the development of the Yiddish press over time. And I'm happy to elaborate in any way, but that's a relatively short synopsis.
Uh-huh. So, okay. So why don't you, before we get to the thesis, I mean, we started with the thesis. We're going to come back to the thesis. But would you mind saying a few words about the Yiddish press, just in sort of broad strokes? What do you mean by that? What was it?
Sure. So I think it's important to keep in mind that at the turn of the 20th century, Yiddish newspapers were incredibly influential political and cultural institutions in the United States and abroad. They set the tone for American Jewish life in many ways and served a variety of invaluable roles for their readers. So by the 1920s or so, if you were a Yiddish-speaking farmer or housewife or theater goer or humor lover, you could find sort of a specific niche periodical to fit your interests. But there were also daily newspapers that were hoping to attract a broader, more mass audience. Each of them had a specific ideological window, so Orthodox Judaism, alignment with the Republican Party, the Socialist Party, communism. But most of the most successful daily newspapers tried to court a mass audience outside of that ideological window, the logic there being that it would help them win over rivals in the battle for circulation figures, but also advertisers' dollars and eventually ideological influence. So that meant that all of these newspapers were contending with one another for readers and writers. I think it's also important to note before we sort of talk about the American Yiddish press in more detail that this transformation of Yiddish newspapers into these successful, essential, sort of central institutions in American Jewish life really was not an inevitable thing that was inevitably going to happen. So one of the things that I learned from your book and from my research was that there was no real precedent for Yiddish newspapers on this scale in Eastern Europe before the mass consumption Yiddish press took hold in the United States. So there were a handful of weekly or monthly newspapers before the 1880s, but most of them attracted pretty small reading audiences. And because of censorship laws that restricted Yiddish publishing in the Russian Empire, the first daily Yiddish newspaper in Eastern Europe didn't appear until about 20 years after the founding of the first Yiddish daily in the United States. So the mass consumption Yiddish press really blossomed as an American phenomenon before it took hold in Europe. And many Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, especially those who came over before, I'd say about 1900, would never have really read newspapers before coming to America. And then within about a generation, they started to see newspapers as sort of central, indispensable parts of their daily lives, as sources of entertainment, news, guidance, advice, friendship, all of these different things. And it became by far the most successful foreign language market for newspapers in the United States. So something I like to mention in all my talks is that at its height, the circulation of the most popular Yiddish daily, the Forward, surpassed that of the New York Times. So this was a really central American institution as well as being a Jewish institution.
Now, those readers were men and women, maybe not in equal numbers at the beginning, but eventually the numbers are equal. That's correct, right?
Well, we don't have exact readership numbers, which is a big frustration in trying to do this research. We don't have sort of full access to accurate circulation figures. All of the circulation seems a bit doctored, and accurate sort of breakdowns of who is reading what. But from the beginning of these newspapers on, every American Yiddish newspaper felt that it was crucial to be attracting both men and women of a variety of education levels, of a variety of sort of ideological agendas, but the idea of having both men and women was really central to the development of the Yiddish press, yeah.
And was the reason for that strictly commercial?
I wouldn't say
the more readers, the better, the more profitable, the higher the circulation, more advertisers, all that.
So it was a variety of different things at once. So one of the things I explore in my book is the ways in which sort of attracting a female audience in specific, or discussing the interest in attracting a female audience became a way for Yiddish newspaper producers to talk about all of their different goals in publishing newspapers. So in some cases, it became a way to be talking about the relationship of the American Yiddish press, this relatively new form, to long-standing traditions within Jewish culture that equated mass culture in Yiddish with a female audience. In other cases, it was a way to sort of market these newspapers as thoroughly American cultural sort of endeavors. The rise of the Yiddish press in the late 19th century was at the same time that American newspapers in English were transforming from political into more commercial ventures. And they were starting to be funded by advertising and circulation. And this is the time when newspapers in English started to include things like women's pages, women's columns, advice columns for the first time. So the idea of attracting a female audience became a way for Yiddish newspapers to make a claim for their Americanness as well. There were also many commercial reasons, but there were also obviously ideological reasons as well. All of these newspapers wanted to sort of encourage their readers to think about American life and Jewish life in certain ways. And that was true for both their male and their female readers. They saw both men and women as playing sort of integral roles in the Jewish community and in broader American society. And so therefore, speaking to all of these audiences was also a way to make sure that ideological content catered to everyone within the Jewish cultural sphere.
All right, so now we're getting back to your thesis.
Yes.
So to say, okay. So if you can, I mean, I imagine you just touched on some of it. you sum up two things for us. One, why women are crucial to study. Are you and is gender the same thing as studying women here, or do you mean something else by gender in the title? And how did you discover this? In other words, there's a fair amount of history written in Yiddish and English of the Yiddish press. Not a huge amount, but there's some solid foundation. I don't recall a great deal of attention. Certainly nobody placed it at the center of their research like you did. So those are my two questions. How do you discover how important this is? And can again you explain to us exactly how you see the importance? I think you see it probably on more than one level. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. So I'll sort of provide a couple of pieces of information, and hopefully that will answer all of these questions together.
Okay.
So the first thing I want to say is that one of the things I'm arguing in the book is that questions of women and gender, and I'll talk about the difference between those two, are crucial to understanding sort of how and why the Yiddish press grew from being this sort of relatively small publishing market into such a powerful and multivalent force in American society, or American Jewish society. So one of the things that I wanted to think about with this project is the ways in which women's content was present from almost the very start of the Yiddish press, but became more sort of complex and salient over time. So part of this is about sort of women who are working for these newspapers and women readers, but a lot of it is also about sort of this category called women's content. So the idea that there are certain types of content that are meant to appeal to women. So that includes advice columns, serialized fiction, advertising, women's columns. In reality, of course, these features were popular with men as well as women. And women readers never really confined their reading habits to the parts of the paper that were specifically set aside to women.
Right.
So one of the things that I want to do by talking about women and gender is think about sort of the way in which these newspapers construct sort of ideas or representations of gender as being separate from the lived reality of the women readers and writers associated with these newspapers. But sort of connected to that, and I think this will start to get at the question, your second question as well, is thinking about sort of the ways in which questions of gender sort of figure into the debates around the Yiddish press, which end up having very little to do with the actual reading habits of women, and have a lot more to do with the kinds of claims that editors are trying to make about their publications. So part of the process of researching this book was rereading sources that a lot of other people have looked at, but rereading them against the grain and thinking of them not as sort of accurate depictions of what was happening on the ground, and more as sort of rhetorical tropes or sort of arguments that people were making in order to sort of make certain cases about what their newspapers were doing. So a good example of this is that Abraham Kahan, when he talks about his return to Yiddish.
That's the editor of the famous Yiddish Daily Forward.
Yes. Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's a helpful thing to clarify. So Abraham Kahan, who was the longtime editor of the Forward, he took this sort of break for 5 years and worked for English language newspapers, then came back to the Yiddish press. And he and other people described this phenomenon very frequently, this moment of transition. And the way that they described it was inherently gendered, which was basically before Kahan was the editor of the Forward for the second time, so before 1902 or so, only men read the Forward. But when Kahan came back, men and women read the Forward because he wanted to turn it into a mass consumption paper. This was not actually based on the actual reading practices of the American Jewish community. There was a women's column in the Forward before he came back, so there is an assumption that women are reading it. But you see throughout the sort of rhetorical debates surrounding the Yiddish press, this same trope come up over and over. So in a memoir that he wrote, Abe Kahan, for example, talks about, he comes back to the Forward, and Naftali Hertz Imber, the poet, storms into the office and says, just think, women are starting to read the Forward. That means that we're going backwards politically. And he makes this case over and over that this is the kind of thing that people were saying in order to denigrate him, or to say that his type of journalism was good. So it was either a positive or negative spin, but none of this actually reflected the actual reading habits of women. It was more a way to talk about commercial culture, popular culture, the kinds of things that a socialist Yiddish daily newspaper trying to reach a mass audience should have.
Now, if did any newspapers claim that by having women readers, they were somehow more modern, more American, more progressive, or something like that? Was there an idealistic claim made on having women readers?
Yes, especially there was somewhat about women readers. It was more of a claim about women writers.
Women writers.
So beginning in about 1914, all of these newspapers introduced women's pages for the first time. And part of the marketing strategy surrounding the introduction of women's pages to the American Yiddish daily press is saying that this shows the ways in which the Yiddish press has reached a more modern, more progressive stage of its development, because we are allowing women this place in terms of readership, but also we are allowing more women to write within these newspapers. And some of this is a really interestingly coded argument about the Americanness of these newspapers yet again, because part of what they were trying to do, beginning in 1914, the world is at war, and there is a deep sort of fear of foreign language culture in the United States. And one of the ways that the Yiddish press tries to combat that is by showing the ways in which the Yiddish press is in and of itself American. And they think that having a women's page, which makes the layout of things like the forward look more like general American newspapers, is a way to say, look how American we are. So yet again, that has very little to do with the actual content on these pages and more about what it is trying to sort of say to a broader audience about what the Yiddish press is.
Who are some of these women, assuming they are women who write for the women's page, the women's pages? Who are they? Can you give us a couple of examples of these women writers, journalists?
Sure. So I'll start with a few examples of women who became successful writers working for the Yiddish press. But I also am going to emphasize the fact that quite a few of the names of women that appeared in the Yiddish press were actually covers for male authors. And I'll talk about that phenomenon as well. It was throughout the history of the Yiddish press, but also during this period of the rise of women's voices in the Yiddish press. Many of the women's voices were not actual women. So one example that I explore in my book is Rosa Lebensboim, who is a very prominent writer in a variety of genres. She's better known by her pseudonym Anna Margolin, which she wrote poetry under. But during most of her life, she made her living working as a journalist for various different newspapers, but mostly the more sort of intellectual middlebrow Der Tag. She was a writer for that newspaper for quite a while, but she also edited their women's page for a good amount of time and wrote women's material under various pseudonyms. So that it looked like there were more women writing for this page than there actually were. And I like talking about her. One, I think she's a beautiful and brilliant writer, and that this part of her sort of writing oeuvre has not been given the due that it deserves. It's really beautiful and really trenchant writing. But it's also a really good example of the ways in which women who worked for the Yiddish press had sort of this weird dynamic where in some ways they were very undervalued. They were asked to write content that was very specifically women's content. It had to be about love or marriage or housekeeping or childcare. And many women felt very constrained by those things. But at the same time, there was also a sense of freedom within these constraints. This was also true in the American popular press in English. It was very important for these newspapers to have women's columns or women's pages, but editors didn't always pay close attention to what women wrote in these columns. So there was a lot of freedom of movement for these women. And so Rosa Lebensboim used her women's columns as a way to talk about everything she hated about the newspaper she worked for. Which are very funny, but it's also very helpful because many of these women, unlike many of the men I write about, there aren't that many sources to retell their lives. And we have these columns where you can see something about what they're thinking. And you may have to read those against the grain as well, but it gives you some sense of what's going on there. Another example I like to think about, or I like to talk about in my work is Ray Raskin was another journalist who worked for various different newspapers. And she's important to think about because she worked for newspapers that really spanned the ideological agenda of the Yiddish press. And she changed her political arguments based on which newspaper she was writing for. So when she was writing for some of the more sort of small newspapers that were Zionist and socialist, she wrote women's columns that were specifically geared towards that demographic. But then when she was writing for more sort of broadly middle class women's magazines and things like that, she was like, I will not talk about politics. Politics are not part of the equation. Other writers, in contrast, so Adela Keen-Zemetkin is a really good example of this. She was a very prominent she's an amazing writer and a prominent orator. And she wrote for various different newspapers. Some of them were socialist, some of them weren't. And no matter what she was writing for, she wrote like deeply socialist columns. She did not care whether that fit her audience or not. And so together they give you a sense of how complex and rich this content was, but also this broader sort of set of questions that applies to the whole Yiddish press, not just the women's pages, which is that the people writing for these newspapers were often the same people writing for deeply orthodox newspapers, deeply socialist newspapers. Sometimes they would change what they were writing to fit their ideological agenda of the writing venue that they were working for, meaning that it wasn't necessarily what they actually believed. But in other cases, they undermined the ideological agenda of the newspaper they were writing for by writing whatever they wanted. So calling a newspaper socialist or orthodox or whatever doesn't give you the full sort of reading experience that readers would have had, because there's a lot of complexity and a lot of contradiction within these newspapers that's so important to keep in mind.
I remember reading a, purportedly orthodox newspaper from the 1890s. And the editor said to his readers, you should read this socialist magazine, particularly socialist magazine, because you can learn a lot from it. Because it was an educational magazine as well as a political magazine. So, he thought it was perfectly fine. Not fine. He encouraged his readers to read this radical leftist magazine for that reason. So, yeah, what you're saying about the fluidity was really true. So could you say more about, let's go back to Zemetkin, or, Adela Keen-Zemetkin, just to give an example of how a Russian-born Jewish woman finds her way to journalism, Yiddish journalism.
So she's a good example because the patterns that she follows are sort of relatively true for many other women writers. In that it is very hard for women to actually gain entry into the world of Yiddish journalism, and it is much easier if you have some sort of personal connection to a man who has some sense of power. In her case, her husband, Michal Zemetkin, was a one-time editor of the Forward and was a prominent socialist leader. And that is what allowed her entry into Yiddish journalism in the first place. So she began by writing sort of occasional articles on a variety of issues for several of the different socialist newspapers. And then she also worked behind the scenes in the first years of the Forward as a cashier and sort of account manager for the Forward to try to make sure it was staying afloat in those first few years. And one of the things that is interesting to trace is that she's also there in the advertisements in the early Forward as an English teacher and a piano teacher, which gives a sense of the fact that the early staff of the Forward all had many other jobs besides what they were doing for the newspaper, because the newspaper was so strapped for cash at this time. And she talks with her daughter. Her daughter was Laura Z. Hobson, the novelist. She wrote A Gentleman's Agreement. And so we know some things about her life from that, from her daughter's sort of recollections. She talked with her daughter about the fact that she didn't necessarily want a career in journalism. She wanted to be a dentist. And she married her husband when he already had several kids from a previous relationship. Then they went on to have several kids. And she couldn't figure out how to balance going to dental school with having children, but she could figure out how to send in articles to newspapers. So she felt like this was the way for her to be able to continue her sort of political ideals and have some sort of entree into the broader world while still being able to take care of her children. So it was in some ways a very emancipatory experience for her to be working in journalism, but in some ways it was a story of sort of responsibility and how do you balance all of these parts of your life.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating, to see how, what becomes of their children, so the lives of the people you're talking about, and then subsequent generations, as you said, her daughter became a very famous writer, Gentleman's Agreement and other things she wrote. Always fascinated by that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's return to what they wrote.
Mhm.
Could you give us, this might not be fair, but can you give us something particularly juicy or memorable or instructive, what have you, of something one of the newspapers ran, either written by a man or a woman? And so what you might see, to illustrate what the reader saw and read.
Yeah, so I'll give you sort of a few different snippets, which sort of give you a sense of the sort of broad variety of things. So one person who I focus on a lot in my book is Getzel Zelikovic, who was one of the early editors for one of the more religiously oriented newspapers. And he's also the sort of first women's columnist in the American Yiddish press. He wrote women's columns under the name The Lithuanian Wise Woman. And they're really
What's the significance of that? I'm sorry to interrupt. What's the significance of that pseudonym?
So he had various pseudonyms, and his first one was the Lithuanian philosopher. And so it was a takeoff on that, the Lithuanian Wise Woman.
I see.
And it's this really fascinating thing. So he creates this entire backstory for her. He also is writing a lot of sort of entertaining serialized fiction at this time. And one of these fiction pieces turns into the origin story of the Lithuanian Wise Woman. She grows up in present-day Lithuania. She's relatively well off, sort of middle-class upbringing. She falls in love with an older man, and they eventually make their way to the United States with their family, and then they're met at the boat by the editor of this newspaper, the Tageblatt, the Jewish Daily News, and the Lithuanian philosopher, who were both friends of her husband from their childhoods. This is all fake, but this is the story that is told. And they're like, oh, you're good at giving other women advice. Why don't you become our advice columnist?
You're good at giving other people advice.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because like these columns give sort of very fascinating, very trenchant and complex advice. But also Zelikovic is writing other columns under his name or other names that make it clear that he is the Lithuanian Wise Woman. So depending on what you're reading, you'll have a very different sense of these columns. So if you're just reading these columns, you might see them as sort of very straightforward women's column, advice by a woman. But if you're reading them in tandem with Zelikovic's other writing, you'll have a very different experience, which I think is very interesting. So that's one example. And if we're thinking about the content of these columns, so one sort of series of interactions that I really enjoy in these columns is that Zelikovic, writing as the Lithuanian Wise Woman, writes this article in, I forget the year, or somewhere around 1908, about the suffrage movement in England and talking about sort of the positive sort of ideas it's bringing to the world. The next day or sometime that week, Zelikovic writes an article under his own name criticizing this column and saying that it is very improper for the Lithuanian Wise Woman to be offering readers, especially sort of women readers who are prone to suggestion, role models who are outside of Jewish circles. Instead, she should be offering readers biblical role models. And so he offers the prophet Deborah as a model instead. And so if depending on your level of sort of insider knowledge, this could either be seen as two different perspectives or as a tongue-in-cheek back and forth between the same person. Is very interesting.
That's so interesting. I want to tell you something I've seen in some of the socialist Yiddish newspapers, of which there were many. Tell me if you've seen this and what you make of it. So, of course, as you know, the Yiddish forward was criticized all the time. It had many critics coming from different perspectives. in one perspective was that the newspaper was guilty of watering down or presenting somehow vulgar, that was the word that was often used,
Yeah.
vulgar articles about culture, literature, socialism. It wasn't giving really serious articles. It was, again, often watered down or something like that. So in that context, its critics, especially coming from the socialist side, said that the newspaper was pandering to yentas.
Yep.
And you'd see cartoons with Abe Khan, the editor, kind of, in some way spoon feeding his newspaper to yentas. It was accused of yentism sometimes. What is that? What about, have you seen it? I think you probably have. And what do you make of this? Here's maybe where gender analysis can help understand what a what a yent is and why a yent is bad in the context of the Yiddish newspaper market, or good, I guess, depending on your perspective.
Well, it's this complicated thing. This trope appears over and over again. And in my book, like right in my introduction, I include one of these cartoons because I think they're amazing. The one that I include is from William Gropper, who was the longtime cartoonist for the Freiheit, the communist newspaper. And it's Kahan dressed in women's clothing on top of the Ford building. He's basically been turned into his ideal audience.
Yes. Which is just be, if you can specify, what does women's clothing mean in this context?
Well, he has his like signature mustache, but he also has a bun and like a dress, and he's brandishing a pan, and he's wearing like an apron, I believe.
I see. So a housewife, a housewife.
A
housewife, yeah.
And so it's this interesting thing because in some ways this is sort of drawing on these long associations within Yiddish culture that things that are written in Yiddish are for women and uneducated men. So this woman is sort of like this uneducated housewife in that way. And so therefore it's like an association of gender with lack of political or ideological knowledge. But it's also this sense that women are the ones, or especially housewives are the ones who are buying goods for their families, and therefore turning these into commercial newspapers in the style of the American press means appealing to housewives in specific. So all of this within that sort of rhetorical loop makes it seem as if appealing to women is, first of all, appealing to this specific kind of woman and is seen as negative. But it's interesting because even the publications that critique the Forward in this way also have these questions about how to appeal to women. So one thing that I explore in my book, which is like towards the end of the period that I focus on, is the debates surrounding the Freiheit's decision to include a women's page, which includes
Freiheit's the communist Yiddish newspaper.
The communist Yiddish newspaper. And so it's founded in 1922, and it takes about 4 years for it to begin to include a women's page. And Rachel Holtman, who is the wife of one of the editors, is in charge of this page. And she writes this series of columns discussing, or purporting to discuss, we don't know how accurate it is, the debates within the editorial rooms. Like they were just sitting around and being like, should we have a women's page? So on the one hand, some people were saying that if you have a women's page, that's saying that women have separate needs than men, and that's problematic. But the other side was saying, no, women need special content because they have specific roles that they're fulfilling in life. But then afterwards, when it is decided, according to Rachel Holman, when it is decided that there will be a women's page, there are two camps again. The first camp says women can't understand ideological content. They should just have entertaining material. That's all that they can handle. And the other side said women readers of the Freiheit, of this communist newspaper that is marketing itself as more ideologically serious, but also literarily deep.
Superior.
The women readers are like all of the readers of the Freiheit. They're coming to it for more serious content. So it would be deeply problematic to include more entertaining content for women. So even within this newspaper that sees itself as not pandering to its audience in the same way as the Forward, there are debates about whether appealing to women is pandering in some way, which I think is very interesting.
So if, according to the critics, the housewife is the Forward reader, the standard for, and that's bad, somehow to be a housewife who reads is somehow a sign of not being educated, not being, interested in entertainment, not being politically enlightened. How is the female reader of, let's go back to the Freiheit, how is the female reader depicted there, or in any other Yiddish newspaper for that matter?
Well, it's interesting because in their critiques of the forward, all of these newspapers rely on this particular trope, but then they also are relatively condescending to their female audiences themselves. So all of them sort of bolster this ideology while also using it to critique their rivals, which I think is a complicated dynamic. Yeah.
And again, so that is to say that all of these newspapers at times are associated with the housewife as reader. So is that's a stock in trade stereotype?
Yeah, and there's also like a mix of ideological content that like whatever the ideological line of the newspaper is reflected and perhaps skewed towards a feminine point of view, but all of them also assume women want entertaining reading material, sensational reading material, that they'll only be able to understand things if it's dumbed down for them. And for all of them, this really becomes a cover talking about these kinds of women audiences, become a cover to talk about how to deal with audiences of varying education levels. So not actually about women.
What's the reality? Is the reality that there are Yiddish women of all ages, of various levels of education and literacy and so on? Is the reality that there's actually a fairly broad spectrum of women readers?
Yes, but there's also a broad spectrum of male readers. There's a broad spectrum of readers of the Yiddish press in general. And that is sort of central to their dynamics throughout their run, that there are new people coming in throughout this time of varying different sort of previous literacy knowledge, previous ideological commitments. So these newspapers have to cater to an audience that is coming at this from a variety of different levels. And that is not just women, and that is true throughout. And so their women's pages are in some ways coded as for women, and in some ways coded as for a mass audience, a broad audience, for audiences who are looking for entertaining material, no matter what gender they are.
Now tell me about letters to the editor. I'd imagine that's also a place you'd find women's voices.
Yes, in some cases, women's voices that are authentic, in some cases, women's voices that are less authentic.
Less authentic means the editor made up the letters.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, one of the interesting dynamics that takes shape in the Yiddish press is that there are sort of write-in columns throughout the history of the Yiddish press. So like people asking questions and receiving answers, that kind of thing. But the advice column, as we think of it, with sort of narrative questions that are longer and long responses, really begins after the turn of the 20th century and is modeled on what is happening in the American popular press, the advice columns of Miss Lonely Hearts style in the American popular press. But in the Yiddish press, the same columns are, if they are seen as like broad columns and not women's columns, advice columns as opposed to women's columns, they're usually handled by male editors. At least that is who signs them, is male editors. The idea that this is male-coded advice as opposed to female-coded advice, which is what it was in the American popular press, which is an interesting change. There were women who wrote advice columns in the Yiddish press, but they were seen as sort of columns that were just for women as opposed to for a broader audience.
Do you recall any of these letters that might have been especially interesting? And related to that is a question of, well, if you read these letters really carefully, for the reason you said, they could be forgeries. What do you learn about women and men and other things?
It's a good question, and it's a complicated question because of these sort of questions about who wrote what and when and how, and I can get back to those questions in a sec because I think they're very interesting. But a letter that I like to talk about is the first letter that appeared in the Bintel Brief, which was the most successful Yiddish advice column. It was in the foreword. It was introduced in 1906, so several years into Kahan's editorship or second editorship of the paper. And the way he tells it in his memoir, he had spent a long time trying to figure out how to get the advice column model from the American popular press into the Yiddish press, and he couldn't figure out how to sort of encourage readers to write the right kind of material to be included in an advice column. until he got this one letter in the mail out of
Mm.
the blue, as he says. Again, I'm a little skeptical. And it's from a housewife who lives on the Lower East Side. She's very poor, but she bought her husband this watch. And her neighbor, she believes, stole this watch because her neighbor is also poor. And what she wants, or what she asks for in this letter, is not to reprimand the neighbor, but to use the foreword as a mouthpiece to tell the neighbor that she understands why she stole it and that she forgives her. And for Kahan, the way he talks about it in his memoir, this is sort of the ideal type of content for these newspapers because it is full of sort of pathos, as well as being full of sort of class consciousness at the same time. And like that mixture is really what he's going for there.
Yes.
Which I think is really important. But when I teach things like the Bintel brief to my students, I try to talk to them about the process through which they're edited behind the scenes so that we don't think of them as sort of unmediated sources for sort of access to American Jewish life. There's a study from the 1930s, I think it's from 1930, by a man named George Wolfe, who was a graduate student, who the forward gave him the actual letters they received from readers and the Bintel brief letters. Usually they burned all letters after they looked at them. So like in general, we do not know the correlation between the two. And what he found is that most of the letters were real, but were so heavily edited and changed that they can't be seen as sort of accurate depictions of what the letter writer was exactly saying. So they would change facts to make them more compelling. They would streamline information. They would change facts to sort of fit with whatever the newspaper wanted to talk about. And then all of them also sort of made sure to include how important the forward was to the development of the reader.
Tell me if you think this is a fair thing to say about the letters to the editor, especially advice column letters. They may have been doctored, rewritten, and so forth. And in that sense, they're not accurate depictions of the letters. But the letters, after they were rewritten, were authentic reflections of the concerns of the reading public.
They were authentic reflections of what the newspaper considered the concerns of the reading public, I would say.
And given the popularity of these columns, does that say anything about the congruity between what the newspaper editors thought they were doing and the readership's desires?
Well, it's a good question. I would say in general, yes, with a couple of caveats, which is how are people reading these columns? And it's very clear from evidence, even at the time, that some people read the Bintel brief or other advice columns for actual advice, for a sense of connection, for a sense of support, for a sense of sort of things to apply to their own lives, and other people are reading it for pure entertainment value.
Pure entertainment, okay.
And so newspapers are choosing what to include for both of those impulses.
I see. So if it's just for entertainment, then it doesn't matter necessarily in the eyes of the reader how realistic it is.
Exactly.
I see. Okay. Switching gears, I'm curious to know where your research is taking you now.
Yeah. So one of the things that I sort of uncovered during the research process for this book is that while I was scrolling through these newspapers, so I did this research back, or a lot of this research back when newspapers were on microfilm. Now many of them have been digitized, which has totally transformed the scholarship on the Yiddish press. But I was scrolling through newspapers from 1917, and I started to notice this mark that says true translations of these articles submitted to censors for approval. And it sort of uncovered this thing that I had never heard about before, which is that during World War I, Yiddish newspapers and other foreign language newspapers and English language newspapers of various political stripes were censored and surveilled by the American government. And there was a very complicated process through which this happened. And my next book is going to be exploring sort of how this happened, why this happened, and sort of the mechanisms that were put in place because of it.
So it sounds, well, on one level, this is very different from your recently published book, but it is, I would say, if I may say this, equally innovative. So first of all, I want to stress this, what you found in the first book, I asked you about it earlier, we meandered away. There's no book on women, gender, and the Yiddish press. So it's groundbreaking in that regard. There is, I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, tell me if this is overstating it, but I don't think there's a single book or article written about American censorship. Okay, that might be overstated, but
there's one article by
Yeah.
Lucy Davidovich
oh, okay.
from 1962,
Uh-huh.
64. And it's focusing on one small anecdote within this broader story. But when I went to the National Archives this summer and I found 10,000 documents related to surveilling the Yiddish press.
Yeah.
It's this broad story that tells us really important information about American Jewish life in this
Okay,
period.
so that's what I'm curious about. What are some of the implications of the research?
Sure. So the first, I mean, I'm still very early on in the process, so I can't tell you anything definitively. But the first thing I want to think about is sort of these records give a sense of sort of deep and pervasive anti-Semitism within the American state that I think we haven't fully reckoned with.
You mean the federal government?
The federal government.
Which branch? Can I just interrupt and say ask you which branches you're
Oh,
referring
it's a variety. So it's the Bureau of Investigations. It's both branches of Congress. It's the post office, which are the ones in charge of the actual censorship. But they're also connected to the State Department. Like all of these branches are talking to each other about the Yiddish press.
Keep coming.
Yeah. And then they're like the congressional record is full of accusations of spies working for the Yiddish press, for example. So that's one thing. The other thing is the ways in which Jewish actors from various sectors of society sort of react to this censorship by bolstering it and serving as informants throughout the process, both working for the government and working behind the scenes, sometimes for ideological or political reasons, and sometimes to try to get rivals out of business. And then the other thing that I'm really thinking about here is the ways in which we as scholars of American Jewish history think about the process of Americanization. And we're often thinking of it in relatively sort of, I don't know exactly how to word it, but like non-coercive terms, I guess. The idea of it being a process that people are deciding how they want it to be conducted for themselves with guidance. But this is showing sort of the outside pressures that are encouraging or forcing Americanization and forcing it to go in certain directions. And I think that's important to think about as well.
I do too. I mean, it turns on its head what most American Jews have thought about. I mean, censorship seemed to be Russian. Let's put it that way. You know, we think of censorship that's a Russian phenomenon. It's a situation of unfreedom for Jews and most everyone else. The Yiddish press is, we talked about at the beginning, is defined by, it flourishes because there's no censorship. It's one reason what flourishes. Now it's 1917 and the US is censoring the Yiddish press. It's not, in a way you could say it's not supposed to happen according to the American Constitution, but also the expectations that Jews themselves have. So we're seeing a more complicated reality. I should say that the censorship stops, what, 1920?
Yeah, 1919, 1920. So it continues after the war and becomes sort of the way that the US government censors radical culture in the United States, is the same sort of mechanisms. So it's part of the first Red Scare. But it's a relatively short period of time. And a lot of these Yiddish newspapers are able to survive. But I think that's also interesting to think about, because that's not true of other foreign language newspapers necessarily.
Well, this is, I think we should turn to some questions. I can't wait for the new project to be finished. Hopefully it'll be done in about a couple of months or by the end of the year. So we can benefit.
Realistic timeline.
No pressure. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And hopefully we have unmediated questions coming from the audience.
Yeah, I want to, before we move into questions, I just want to say thank you both for that really interesting discussion. And I'm also looking forward to the new book. So
thank you.
So
in 10 years.
Okay, well, we'll stay tuned. We'll have a sequel. So early on you talked about sort of Americanization being a part of the Yiddish press, and you just talked about sort of coerced sort of Americanization in a way part of this, but was that sort of a cognitive part of the Yiddish press in terms of like helping people reading it to become American? Maybe you can just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that was true of Yiddish newspapers from their very beginning in the United States, that there was some level of, I'm going to call it broadly Americanization. That's a little bit of a fraught term because it sort of assumes there's one way to become American. So acculturation, I guess, or something like that might be a broader term, but all of these newspapers include some amount of civics lessons. So like information on the American Constitution, American history, things like that, how to play baseball, voting guides before elections, things like that. Starting in the 1890s, so relatively early, some of these newspapers have English pages as well. So there's an assumption that some of them are teaching English to readers and some of them are trying to cater to the children of readers who are reading Yiddish. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the actual process of turning immigrants to the United States into regular Yiddish newspaper readers is in and of itself a process of an Americanization. And Yiddish newspapers are sort of very cognizant of that from their beginning as well. So there are lots of really fascinating articles that are sort of teaching people how to read newspapers and what you're supposed to look for from different types of content. And often that is very gendered, is what I have found. So for example, the Lithuanian wise woman who I talked about before talks to readers about like how to read sort of serialized fiction as opposed to reading advice columns, and saying like serialized fiction you should read for entertainment purposes. Don't get your advice from there. But read advice columns for more serious things. And like, if you want to read the news section, if you're a woman, maybe read it for sensationalism, but like, you're not going to be as interested in these other things. So the idea of like, there's an assumption behind that people are looking for guidance about how to interact with a newspaper. Whether that's true or not is a little hard to tell, but it does seem to be something that the Yiddish press sees as part of its role.
Sure, thank you. Another question that came in, and I'm going to add a little bit of a question that I had to it as well. So from my understanding, a lot of these papers end up becoming published totally in English, or a few of them at least, and including like the foreword now, I'm pretty sure is published entirely in English.
There's a Yiddish online version, but mostly in English, yeah.
But mostly in English. So what happens to these women's columns as the papers kind of move more towards English rather than Yiddish?
Good question. So English pages start to appear in these newspapers beginning in the 1890s, and they often include a lot of content for women even then. So there's a sense that English pages, because they're supplementary, have to be entertaining, in a sense that like all of these newspapers conflate entertaining and feminine, even from this early stage. And so that continues to be true later on as well. Most of the papers that I study are still very much Yiddish language publications at the end of the period that I study, which is 1925 or so, even if they have an English language supplement. But there's still this sense that they need to include some content for women.
Thank you. And so you talked about the Lithuanian washerwoman and
Wise woman, yeah.
Yeah, wise woman, I'm sorry, excuse me. And, how the man who wrote her columns kind of talked about suffrage on both sides in a way, but were these newspaper talking about suffrage at all? Like, was that a widespread thing? And it's like, what were they speaking about? And was there sort of encouragement towards or against?
Yeah, I'd say before about, this is going to be inexact, but about 1910, these newspapers are very mixed on how they feel about suffrage. On the Orthodox side, there's a sense that it's not necessarily proper. And on the radical newspaper side, socialist, anarchist, there's a sense that these movements are very bourgeois. And so therefore, it will not actually help working class women. But by about 1910 or so, all of the Yiddish newspapers across the board are relatively pro-suffrage and use their ideological framework to say that their vision of femininity is the most pro-suffrage. So whether you're a socialist newspaper or an orthodox newspaper, all of them sort of lay claim to being the most pro-suffrage of all of the newspapers by the time, like, like several years before suffrage is passed in New York and then the United States as a whole.
And I know you study a sort of specific moment in time, but do you see any of the like thoughts that you talked about sort of about how women read newspapers and like what appeals to women? Do you see any of that sort of continuing in the press today, or maybe in like any of the newspapers that have survived into the present day? Do you see any of that influence continuing?
Yeah, I mean, it's often a little more coded today and a little less sort of overt. So women's pages eventually in most English language newspapers become sort of lifestyle pages or style pages, which still have the same content as women's pages, but are no longer called women's pages in that same way. So there's still this sense of like gendered content and this content as entertaining.
Thank you. And so can you talk a little bit more in depth about how you did the research for this book and like how long it took and just kind of the process a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, so this book started as my dissertation many years ago. So it was a variety of kinds of work. So in the beginning, it was mostly scrolling through microfilm for these newspapers. So I started with a certain subset of the newspapers for the dissertation, and then was going to expand it out for the book, which thankfully in the process, in the time period where I was writing the dissertation, and then when it was being turned into a book, thankfully, the Historical Jewish Press website digitized full runs of most of the most successful Yiddish daily newspapers in the United States, which means that during the pandemic, I was able to continue this research, which is an amazing and invaluable experience. This book would not have been possible 10 years ago, which is pretty unbelievable. And similarly, places like the Yiddish Book Center have been doing a lot of digitization of memoirs and things like that that give me background information on all of these sources. So it was those kinds of sources. And then I also sort of triangulated them with archival sources from the newspapers that had them, or writers when newspapers didn't have their own archives. Sometimes the writers who worked for these newspapers did, to try to understand what was happening behind the scenes at these newspapers, how they were talking about their experiences working there, and things like that.
Thank you. So we are almost at the end of our time, but I'm going to end with one last question, and Tony, feel free to jump in on this as well. But I don't want to ask you like what's the most important thing from the book, but like maybe like what's one thing that you hope people take away from reading the book, and maybe Tony, what's one thing you really took away from reading it?
No, you go. I'm not sure. That's gonna take me.
Sure. So I guess this argument I think is very important. It's going to sound a little wonky and methodological, but one of the things that I really want to focus on in this book, and one of the takeaways I hope people have, is sort of how we read Yiddish newspapers as sources about the past. So one thing that I've noticed in the histories of the Yiddish press is that often they're written by people, or relying on sources that are by people that were deeply involved in the production of these newspapers, and often take the things they're saying at face value in terms of what was going on with these newspapers, but also what was important about these newspapers. So there's often a reliance on the political content of these newspapers and saying that that was more important than the other sections of these newspapers. And I want to use this book and the research that I found to sort of question those assumptions and sort of think through, how are these newspapers constructed? What were people reading? Why were they reading what they were reading? How were they reading what they were reading? And how can those questions reshape how we use these newspapers as sources to reconstruct the American Jewish past? So like not reading them as sort of straightforward sources of information, but as sources that need to be interpreted and understood in context in order to understand what kind of information we can get from them to understand American Jewish life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
And I would just say quickly, the biggest takeaway for me is how pervasive women and questions about gender were in the Yiddish press. I think without giving it a whole lot of thought before Ayelet's research, I started reading her research. I think I thought of the women's page, that we were discussing as sort of the main, sort of the extent of the subject. But what Ayelet did was embed that and expand upon that to say that the institution itself is structured around concerns about women and men and all Jews, So that's what I'd say.
Well, thank you both so much again for this really fascinating and interesting chat. And I've learned so much. I know our audience has as well. So thank you both for taking the time to be with us this evening. I highly encourage all of you who joined us to purchase A Revolution in Type, which you can do at the link that I am about to put in the chat. And if you enjoyed this evening's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support.